Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 7 on interest groups and political parties. I'll give you a little introduction on both of those and also how the history of political parties in our country has affected the nature of politics today. So there are some similarities and differences between interest groups and political parties. So they're both groups of political activists. They both form on the basis of common political ideas and goals, and they both use the political system to realize those goals. Now, where they are different is what is at stake for each. For political parties, their main interest is to get their members elected to political office so they can control the government. Democrats or Republicans want to get elected so that they can have power and make laws and focus on the things that they find important. Interest groups, on the other hand, just want to influence what the government does. It usually has nothing to do with public office. They usually just want to lobby for different interests. So the interest groups are also called lobbyists or lobby groups. So sort of in sum there, political parties want to run the government, interest groups want to influence the government. Let's look a little bit more closely at interest groups. They are defined as an organized group of individuals sharing common objectives who actively attempt to influence policymakers. And again, that's their main idea, right? Influencing policymakers. So some examples, you have business interest groups and trade associations that try to influence governmental policies that affect their specific industries. So you have something like the National Association of Manufacturers, who represent manufacturing concerns. There are powerful agricultural interest groups that influence legislation, even though American farmers make up a pretty small minority of the population. Their influence has been really significant, and both sides of the aisle usually support taxpayer subsidies for agriculture. So they promote issues like biotech and farming, and recently focused on reforming some of the Endangered Species Act to balance interests of the environment with economic impacts on ranchers and farmers. Labor interest groups are very powerful too. Today, the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, they've actually joined forces, have 10 million members. They've promoted raising the minimum wage, encouraged government spending on certain sectors like manufacturing and green jobs, and promoted better legislation on unemployment, education, and retirement. Then you have environmental interest groups, which have a pretty sizable membership. The National Wildlife Federation has about 4 million members, and they, for example, focus on conservation efforts for endangered species, preservation of different ecologies like wetlands and marshes, and education for all ages on the importance of being green and curbing global warming. I also forgot here professional interest groups like the American Bar Association, right, for lawyers, or the American Medical Association for physicians. Then you have what's called public interest groups, right here. These groups try to focus on the best interests of the overall community or the national good, rather than narrow interest groups of a like particular group. So they're a little bit more broad. So for example, you have what's called the consumer movement, which focused on publishing information meant to help people, regular people, right? For example, providing information on cars that are unsafe or companies that are utilizing unfair business practices. The Consumer Reports magazine is a good example of this, where you can get opinions and information on things like cameras or cars, for example. Then you have single interest groups that tend to focus on one issue. They're pretty narrow. They're sort of the opposite of public interest groups. And they motivate their supporters to focus on one specific policy goal or an action, like contacting legislators or organizing demonstrations for that one interest. So this could be, for example, the National Right to Life Committee or NARAL Pro-Choice America. Both of these focus on reproductive rights. There's also ideological groups which bring together people of a common ideological viewpoint. For many, the Tea Party represents this, since they have a very similar view on nationalism, they're anti-immigration, and they're pro-gun rights. Identity groups, down here, bring together people who share a common identity, like race. A good example of this is the NAACP, right? The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, founded in 1909. This is a very powerful group that focuses on equal rights for people of color. Or NOW, the National Organization for Women, which has been championing women's rights since 1966. Or you have the AARP, the American Association of Retired People, which is a very large group of elderly Americans. They are 40 million members strong, and they're actually a very powerful interest group and one of the strongest lobbying groups in the U.S. They've played a significant role in the creation of Medicare, which is health care for those people above the age of 65, Medicaid, and increases in the cost of living on Social Security payments. Interest groups use both direct and indirect techniques to try to get what they want, right? To try to influence policy and legislative actions. The direct techniques here are when the interest groups and lobbyists approach the officials personally to present their case. This is first done via lobbying or meeting personally, right? Petitioning the legislature. Back in the day, these individuals would congregate in the lobbies of the legislative chambers. They'd hang out in big groups in the lobby of the building to try to find the leaders and talk to them and try to sway them to their position, right? So that's how they got their name, lobbyists. Today, lobbyists are professionals. They're consultants of companies or DC law firms that actually specialize in this kind of service. They meet privately with public officials to talk to them about the interests of their clients, to provide information that could be used to sway or edit legislation. Sometimes they actually literally send out these giant reports or books of stuff, so the legislators themselves don't have to take the time and do all that research. It's really just in front of them. So that could be used to sway or change legislation. These lobbyists could also be asked to testify in congressional commissions, right? So if they're considering some legislation, excuse me, and they need some, more information or some sort of testimony, the lobbyists could be asked to do that. The lobbyists also invite legislators to, sort of meet and greet cocktail parties. They wine and dine them in very exotic locations to try to build a rapport and influence their decision making. There is a great deal of money involved here. There are also public ratings of legislative behaviors, and this is another attempt to influence legislators. Those interest groups identify the legislation that's most important to their cause, and then they publicly monitor how the legislators vote on them, providing a sort of grade on the legislator in terms of how helpful they are to the interest group's specific cause. So how did this one legislator, this one senator, vote on reproductive rights? How did they vote on this tax bill, right? Whatever is important to that particular lobby's interests, right? Since staying in power is very important, interest groups help legislators who they like in terms of campaign assistance. So they'll also volunteer to pass out literature, or they'll staff different areas of the campaign headquarters, and the legislature wants group endorsements, right? This helps other people know how the legislator is voting or how he or she will vote on certain issues. So the certain interest group, if they're really popular or have a lot of members, they can provide an endorsement for someone running or someone in office to tell their constituents, at least in their opinion, how the person is doing and whether or not they should support them. All right, so these are the direct techniques. We also have indirect techniques, right? Interest groups use indirect techniques to try to influence government policy. So this could include generating public pressure for or against a certain issue through newspaper ads or TV or internet publicity, mass mailings, or even demonstrations. The key is to get the word out on something, right? Try to influence via large groups of people or public pressure. if there are enough people for or against something, it does tend to affect legislation, or at least make the leaders consider different options. Another indirect technique is using constituents as lobbyists. A constituent here refers to anyone who is in the elected official's constituency, right? One of the people that has voted for the elected official. So if you're a Democrat and the elected official is a Democrat, the lobbyists mobilize you and your fellow Democrats to write or phone or tweet or email the legislator or president or whoever it is, right? Because a lot of times the legislator is going to listen to one of their constituents, right? Not some paid lobbyist. Especially since the person is an elected official, they're elected by the people, they're supposed to represent the people and their interests. So generally this is a pretty powerful technique. You have this idea of grassroots campaigning, right? Mobilizing people, regular people like you and I, coming from the constituency. There also could be an issue of astroturf campaigning. And what this means, what's astroturf? It's fake grass, right? It's like plastic or whatever it's made out of. It's not real grass, right? So sometimes you have lobbyists try to make something look like a grassroots campaign, right? Because again, a senator or some sort of representative is going to respond usually a lot more directly to their constituents, to the people that voted for them. So sometimes a lobbyist will try to make something look like a grassroots campaign, but in reality it's an astroturf campaign, sort of a funny way of describing a campaign as fake grassroots. All right, now let's go to political parties. As I mentioned earlier, political parties are different from interest groups. They're not interested in just influencing policies, they actually want to run the government, right? That means winning elections, operating, and determining public policy. Political scientists see political parties as taking three forms, right here, three-headed political giant. It's kind of like water, right? Water is liquid, gas, and solid ice. A party can also be seen in these three ways. So party as organization is small and informal. This is the people who work for the party, right? Like the state and the county chair people or volunteers. You have the bureaucracy here, right? Then you have the party in the electorate, and these are the people that identify with the party and vote for it, right? So a Republican or a Democrat, right? That's the party in the electorate. So you have the bureaucracy, the people kind of working for the party. You have the actual people voting for the party. They're also a part, right? So I can say I'm a Democrat. I'm part of the Democratic political party. And then you have the party in the government, right here, right? The individuals who actually have been elected to government office under the party label. Political parties in the aggregate do several things. They recruit candidates for public office since they want to, remember, gain control of the government, right? It helps when your people are in power. They organize and run elections, from voter registration drives to recruiting volunteers to work at the polls. They present policies as that they develop to the electorate. They accept responsibility for running the government when they do get into office, right? From the president to the majority of members in a legislative body. If they're not in power, they act as the organized opposition to the party in power, right? So it's the out party. So they usually oppose the party that's in office. So again, this is sort of describing the political party in all three forms, right? When, like, the actual bureaucracy, the people that work for the party, when the people actually get elected in government here, and then the people like you and I who identify with the political party. Just a couple of words and concepts I want us to know. This is kind of important. Firstly, the National Convention, right? So each party has a national organization which has a national convention or a national meeting that meets every 4 years to nominate the presidential and vice presidential candidates. During this national convention, the party also develops its position on issues, its principles, its proposed policies, and this is what is called the party platform, right? It's what the party stands for. They also make promises to act on these policies if they are elected to office. And of course, this does change sometimes based on the candidate, but they do generally follow the party lines, right? The sort of agreed upon ideas. Now, ticket splitting or split ticket voting is interesting. Throughout the years, political scientists have noticed that Americans prefer a divided government when the executive and legislative branches of government are elected by different parties or controlled by different parties, right? So the president and Congress are either Democratic or Republican. Rarely do you see a Republican president and Congress or a Democratic president and Congress. So split ticket voting means that you would vote Democrat for one thing but Republican for another, right? This was definitely more prevalent in the past. Nowadays there is a bit less ticket splitting. There are independent voters, people who are not affiliated with one particular party, and they sort of vote all over the board. But American politics is getting more partisanship. So if you're going to vote Democrat for the president, it's not very likely that you'll vote Republican for other offices. Why is that? Well, policies are divisive, and there's very little compromise on most policies or issues, and people are getting increasingly divided. What's interesting is that though Democrats usually vote straight Democrat, there has been a trend of Republicans voting for Democrats, actually, sometimes. And that can be these votes personally, or my speculation is that certain Republican leaderships actually do not identify with their constituencies. So you have Republicans that are, for instance, fiscally conservative but socially liberal, right? They're financially conservative, but they're pro-gay marriage or pro-choice. And there's not too many Republican leaders like that. So something to consider, especially since the 2016 elections are coming up. So I'd like to talk really briefly about the history of political parties, our two-party system. Since the beginning of our country, there's been a two-party system. What does that mean? Well, it describes a system where only two parties have a reasonable chance of winning. The function and the nature of political parties have a lot to do with the specific historical context of the beginning of the country. So I want us just to kind of think about this, and I'm going to highlight three eras of history and how they affected the two-party system. So it began with the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, right? We remember this. One side wanted to adopt the Constitution, right, the Federalists, and the other side didn't. After this, you have the Federalists and the Republicans. The Federalists represented pretty strong commercial interest and a strong national government. And the Republicans, not to be confused with later Republicans, this is very early on, supported artisans, farmers, and were big on states' rights. So you have this sort of transition, right? We have Federalists and Anti-Federalists, we have the Federalists and these Republicans, and then you have this one-party interlude for 20 years, 1800 to 1820. The majority of voters elected Republicans, right? Remember the states' rights people. And the Federalists were pretty much gone at the national level, so there was pretty little political opposition. In 1824, the two-party system is back, right? The Republican Party splits into two. The people that supported John Quincy Adams called themselves National Republicans, later the Whigs, and the Andrew Jackson Party, fan club I like to call them, called themselves the Democratic Party. The Whigs were all about federal spending to improve things like the roads and other internal structures. The Democrats were very against this and instead liked personal liberty and veiled statements like opportunity for the common man. So this, unsurprisingly, escalated especially on the issue of slavery. Right? It's the 1850s, things are getting pretty heated. The Whigs split into two. The Southern Whigs are nervous about a strong government being able to free their slaves, right? So that's not in their interest, so they fall away. And the Northern Whigs unite with the anti-slavery Democrats and other anti-slavery parties to create the Republican Party. Pro-slavery Democrats dominated the South after the Civil War, and they opposed what they saw as cultural coercion by the Republicans, who wanted to impose evangelical religious morals on society. They wanted to limit the sale of alcohol and establish religious public schools. In the 1890s, the Republicans gained an edge over the Democrats with the inclusion of these populist movements in the West and in the South. It was all about these small farmers who were in a lot of debt, and they wanted the government to support inflation, which would reduce the real value of their debt. Right? Since more money is printed, you need more of it to equal what it was previously. Right? For example, if a certain kind of precious metal was ubiquitous, if there was diamonds everywhere, they wouldn't be that expensive, right? It's the same thing with money. If you print a lot of it, you'll need a lot more to sort of make it more valuable. But the Western farmers, so they were pro-inflation, were outnumbered by urban working class voters who were anti-inflation, right? They don't want their money to be worth less. So when the Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan decided to embrace populism and inflation, the working class voters are like, nope, and they switched from Democrat to Republican. Political scientists call this realignment, when there's this large, long-lasting scale and support for one of the two parties, right? Because we have the working class voters switching from Democrat to Republican. And from 1896 to 1932, the Republican Party is pretty successful in setting itself up as the party that was all about the economy. In the early 1900s, you see the spirit of progressivism or reform sweeping through both parties, and a fear of large corporations and a belief that an honest government could regulate the economy. The Republican Party splits temporarily, which allows the Democrat Woodrow Wilson to be elected, along with a Democratic Congress, which doesn't happen very often. Wilson's election and his progressive policies marked the beginning of a huge change in the Democratic Party. So if you remember, the Democratic Party was all about limited government, right, back then. Under Wilson, this changes. The Democratic Party becomes pro-government action in the economy. So there's a lot of changes happening here. So Wilson leaves office and the Republican ascendancy resumes. You have Hoover being elected president in 1928. What happens 1 year later? Right? The Great Depression hits. It's very bad. Hoover takes some measures, but he didn't do enough of what the public wanted, especially when he opposed federal relief for the unemployed and the destitute. There was just too many people who were in a really bad place, and they really wanted government intervention. So in 1932, Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected by a huge margin. This vote in 1932 was also a major political realignment. The Great Depression made a lot of people realize that the Republicans were not perfect when it comes to the economy, and many of them switched sides. Under Roosevelt, the Democrats made major interventions into the economy, which was called the New Deal policies, right? Large-scale anti-poverty programs, from public works to farm and rural programs to Social Security, unemployment insurance, welfare. These programs were also open to African Americans, so that began a large African American population support of the Democratic Party, which, thinking back to the early Democratic Party, who was super racist and pro-slavery, is kind of ironic. Things definitely changed, right, in the American political system, historically speaking. So Roosevelt does really well, and he established modern Democrats as the new majority party, and they kept their power until 1968. It was Democratic presidents continually, except for Eisenhower, who was a Republican during World War II. Because of the large number of African American Democrats, there was a division in the 1960s, right? We learned about the Civil Rights Movement. Democrats who considered themselves, quote unquote, socially conservative, you can understand this as racist, these people left the party, right? even though they may have agreed with the Democrats on economic stuff, especially because a lot of these people were of the lower socioeconomic status, right? They were poorer and they really could have benefited from Democratic policies. Social issues, quote unquote, like race, was more important to them. So they left the Democratic Party and went to the Republican Party. We have developed into a pretty divisive red versus blue or Republican versus Democrat kind of country, and not much has changed throughout the years. It's really just a switching of names. There was always a party, there was anti-civil rights or pro-civil rights. It used to be the Democrats who were anti-civil rights, but now it's the Republicans. So you see this voting map from 1896 compared to the map in 2000, and it's pretty much just a flip, right? Maybe a couple of states are different, but you see very much a two-party system, right? And they're pretty much geographically bound here. Basically, every state that supported Democrat William Jennings Bryan supported Republican George W. Bush in 2000. Again, it was a switching of the names, right? And pretty consistently. So ideas have remained, I would say, largely unchanged, maybe slightly so, but the labels basically flipped completely. So, historical foundations. In the beginning, there were a lot of divisive issues that divided the government, right? Thinking about why the two-party system has endured, right? Federalists and the anti-federalists, North and South, big government, small government, state versus federal power, right? It created this situation where there are two opposing viewpoints. And it sort of created this polarization, right? And this is a 200-plus-year-old ship, right? It's hard to turn around. We have these historical foundations that have set things in motion. So it's pretty difficult to get out of this sort of opposing two-party kind of system. Political socialization, right, means that when we grow up and we learn that there are two parties, two ways of identifying ourselves politically, we tend to follow that model, right? So this is sort of a built-in mechanism to propagate the two-party system. Practically speaking, right, the only realistic way to get office, if that's something you're interested in, is just to go with it. You have to kind of go with what the system has for you, right? So again, thinking about how and why the two-party system has endured, we have historical foundations. We have just the way we've grown as kids in this country. Practically speaking, there are only two. And politically, in terms of socialization, we are socialized to think of ourselves as either Democrats or Republicans. The two-party system is also based on this idea of winner takes all, right? Whoever gets the vote gets everything. So let's say there is a third party. Even if you like what they're proposing, the fact that they will very likely not be voted in would keep you from voting for them, right? The third-party candidate actually usually splits the vote in such a way that the person who doesn't necessarily get the majority can win, right? Let's say there's a Republican, a Democrat, and a super lefty liberal independent. If there is a 50-50 split between Republicans and Democrats, right? And then some Democrats who are super left and super liberal go to this independent person, who wins? The Republican, right? So it's almost considered a throwaway vote. Most people wouldn't want a third party in that case, and this is what is called spoiler effect. You basically sort of take off votes from one of the two major candidates, unfortunately, right? So even if you take 10,000 votes, that could make one of those two-party candidates win. And this is actually what happened in the presidential election of 2000. So Florida is a swing state, and it was between Democrat Al Gore, Republican George Bush, and Green candidate Ralph Nader. So Nader got almost 100,000 votes in Florida, which most people say would likely have gone to Al Gore, the Democrat. It was a super close election, and those votes could have made a difference in what happened. Gore actually won the popular vote and Bush won the electoral college vote. This is the first time since 1888, actually. So if it was between Gore and Bush, Gore could have won because the Green candidate, Ralph Nader, was a bit, he was lefty, right? He was sort of democratic. So that's why people do not tend to vote for independent parties, and it's difficult for them to join in. So there's very little incentive for compromise. In most European countries, they actually have a parliamentary system, unlike our system, which means they have several parties. You can have like 10 parties there. And so there's coalitions that form that provide that sort of provide an incentive for compromise, right? Because you're working with a lot of different kind of people, and you have to sort of find some middle ground, which is easier to do if you have 5 parties, 10 parties instead of just 2, right? So there's another sort of issue and another reason why the two-party system has endured, right? Not only is it super difficult for minor or independent parties to join in, there's pretty small incentive for compromise. And lastly, this reason, there's just state and federal laws that just clearly provide an advantage to 2 major parties, right? For example, they need fewer signatures to get their candidates on the ballot than independent parties. And at the federal level, things are divided up based on 2 major parties. So it's sort of like we don't have a basis to even go off of. It would be a very difficult thing to change. Regardless, many political scientists see the issue of the 2-party system as creating some significant issues in the political system we have today. And you're going to be talking about this in your response papers, thinking about polarization or partisanship, this growing gap between the parties, right? Like 2 ends of a magnet, and we talked about this a while back. I want us to consider, is partisanship a good thing or a bad thing, or is it somewhere in between? So thinking about if it's a bad thing, right? Partisanship, this growing gap between the parties, right? This no compromise, it leads to political paralysis, right? We have a hard time finding compromise, right? We end up doing nothing except fighting over stuff. And it could turn people away from politics and create significant problems in the long run. And sometimes it does turn people into one-issue voters, right? Like, oh, I'm only going to vote based on how this person has voted for abortion stuff or tax stuff or whatever. So it creates kind of this oversimplified system, right? So that's this side. This partisanship is bad. We should get rid of it. Or there's this side who considers it a good thing, right? Well, the problems of partisanship originate with strong ideas and close elections, and these can actually be useful and a good, healthy part of the democratic process. So there should be nothing wrong with intense views and strong ideas. That's sort of where we get bold new ideas, right? The discussion itself is what creates the best ideas, right? So let's talk about this. Let's consider both sides here. And then let's also consider the reality of the situation. That there has been a record high of people that consider themselves independent. As you can see here, the dark green are Republicans, right? The light green, or this kind of yellowy green, are Democrats, right? You see this sort of consistent. And then look at this. This lime green are independents. And as you can see, this is a record high amount of people who consider themselves not affiliated with Republicans or Democrats. This is a Gallup poll from January of 2015. 43% of Americans identify as independents. Something to consider. Why is this happening? Researchers say that this is this decline is identifying with They say that this decline in identifying with one of the main parties has come because people are dissatisfied with the government. There's been partisan gridlock that has come because we have a Democratic president and Republican majority Congress. So very little to do because the president, suggests, puts forth legislation, or not puts forth legislation, but suggests different ideas, and Congress shuts them down. This is especially something that President Obama has faced his last term. Um, so think about this. Does this demonstrate any sort of reality for the issues of partisanship? I think I have one more chart here. You have party identification or leaning kind of oscillating between Democrats and Republicans throughout the years, with spikes generally around elections. Something to think about. Can independents be the potential third party? Let's go back here. Let's consider both sides. Let's talk about it in our response papers and discuss it in the discussion posts. As always, any questions or comments, please don't hesitate.